everyone. It's so nice to be here. In fact, I really want to thank the committee for organizing this. I just this past weekend was in Oakland, California, and some of you may remember Malaquias Montoya, and in fact Steve showed some of his posters in his presentation. And he spoke along with Carlos Montes, who was one of the original organizers of the Chicano Moratorium in Los Angeles. And so they had a panel presentation. So it's nice to know that across the state right now they're commemorating Chicano Moratorium. And again, I want to thank the committee for inviting us. It's like an old town reunion here. And for also commemorating Chicano Moratorium. Because I think what we're realizing now that as we get older and our generation sort of is not as involved as it used to be in terms of these kinds of things, that history can't be lost. And what happened in Oakland was that it was the young generation that was organizing the moratorium. So again, I'm glad that these kinds of things are being done across the country. We're dealing with the era of 68 to 69. But again, before we even get into that, we have to talk about some of the things that created us and led us to that point. I remember one time when I started school in 65, 66 at Fresno State, and we were a bit tapados, as they say, the word we used to use. But what happened was that it cannot be underestimated the amount of influence that the United Farm Workers and the Cesar Chavez had on our development as political activists and our cultural awarenesses as well. That's why I think it's been mentioned by so many speakers, the UFW and their impact. I remember being at Fresno State as a student. I transferred to Berkeley later. But my first years I spent at Fresno State. I remember sitting in class and hearing that Cesar Chavez was going to be coming across campus. They were on their way marching to Sacramento. So at that time we were involved in things like the Spanish Club, because all of us took Spanish, and there was this, as people have mentioned, there were so few of us on campus. That's how we related. We, as Mexicanos, we got into that class and we, sort of had social gatherings and that kind of thing. So we were always proud of being Mexican. We knew we were Mexican American, but we weren't really politically active at that point. When Chavez, and I remember sitting in class and talking to a friend of mine, her name was Matilda from Madera, I'm from Sanger, so we had all these kids coming from different towns. And I remember telling her, you know what, I don't understand how they think they can get higher wages when they don't have an education. And I didn't mean to have that sound mean, but I had swallowed, like they say, line stick and everything, the whole idea that without an education you couldn't achieve anything. Well, there was an Anglo student behind me that laughed when I said that, as if I was speaking against the farm workers. And certainly I wasn't wanting to do that because I supported. I was a farm worker myself, and so were my parents in the early years. But when she laughed, I thought, I need to rethink this. And so when Chavez came to the campus and they held a rally at Fresno State, a lot of us went there. And we realized that the struggle that he was talking about was not just about wages, it was about dignity, it was about fairness, it was about recognizing the contributions that farm workers make every day to our lives. And making us really proud of being who we were, being culturally sensitive, not just that we were Mexican American, but they were going to be part of this movement. And he really focused on the students and said, you have a responsibility to make sure that you contribute to your community. And I think that that was very telling, because that really started, I think, our own political activism and our idea of what it meant to be Chicanos and what it meant to be part of something bigger than ourselves and our social gatherings that we had. So then when we started coming into and becoming, again, very aware of these kinds of things, we started being involved. And I think it's important to recognize that it wasn't just things happening in Fresno State. It was things happening across the state and across the Southwest. I remember that we were MASA at Fresno State, and I think that I will probably talk about that a little bit more, the Mexican American Student Association. It was UMAS in Southern California, United Mexican American Students, and it was MASC, Mexican American Student Confederation, in Northern California. So we were all involved, and in addition to that, there were a lot of little clubs within the small towns all around Fresno of students that were also looking to us for guidance and so forth. So I remember the meeting that was held one time in Los Angeles, one time in Northern California, where somebody said, we need to unite as one and not have all of these different groups, and that's where MECHA was born, the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. And so at that point, everybody changed their name to MECHA. But again, one of the things that started happening is that we would go to meetings in Northern California, we'd go to meetings in Southern California. As Chicano students, we were really trying to connect because we were all dealing with the same issues. We all wanted more Chicano faculty on campus. We all wanted more Chicano students at our universities and campuses. And we certainly wanted to make sure that there was a curriculum that was relevant to us. And at that point, there wasn't any of those things. And I was just mentioning to Raul that I remember a meeting, if you remember now, I've been a professor for, I hate to mention how many years, like 40 years now. And now my students, when I go to conferences, I get them monies, I get them travel, I give them all these things so they can go and stay in hotels and all of this. Well, there was nothing like that for us when we were students trying to do these things. So I remember that nobody had car except me, this old Chevy that my father had given me, and we went to a conference in Northern California, and it was at some Catholic retreat thing that was up a hill. So we're trying to go up the hill in my little Chevy, and it would go up the hill. And so finally all the guys had to get out, and I was one of them, and push the car up the hill. So we could get to our meeting that was so important to us. So again, we really had, I think that out of that grew a real brotherhood and sisterhood, I think, of familia and of being in the struggle together. And it was those times that got us together that sort of helped us survive when there was so few of us in these kinds of environments. There was also times when people from other campuses, like I remember Daniel Hernandez, who was the head of MASC in Northern California, who became an attorney later on and passed away a few years ago. But he came to the campus, and we were, of course, still a little bit shy, just sort of getting involved in things. And we were in a class called the Culturally Deprived. And that class was being taught to talk, and it was about us, Chicanos, right? And we didn't think about, well, that it was a class, that there was an insult in that title. But I remember he came in and went up to the front of the class and said, you know, we're not culturally deprived. We have a rich culture. We may have economic differences and circumstances or educational issues, but to call a class the culturally deprived about Mexican Americans is really an insult to our community. So again, it was things like this, I think, that really started helping us realize the kind of things we're involved in. I also want to mention that it was also a time that Chicanas as women, so we're becoming aware as Chicanos as a people, but it was also a time that we were becoming aware of ourselves as women. And I remember that at the very beginning, guess what we used to do? While the guys had all the meetings, we were in the kitchen cooking. And of course it never occurred to us that, okay, there's something wrong with this picture. Until one day, I remember we were standing at the doorway from the kitchen, right? And the guys were talking and arguing and doing all these kinds of things. And we said, well, they're not saying anything that we don't understand or that we can't contribute to. So I think at that point, and as Jorge Garcia just mentioned to me, one thing that I had forgotten, he said that at one of the meetings, the guys were arguing about who is going to be the leader. And so the women, we came in and we said, you guys, your egos are in the way. You're arguing too much. We decided who's going to be the leader. And it turned out I was the next chair of the Chicano Studies group. So I think that we really, and from then on, there was groups that others will probably talk about. I noticed in Teresa's bio, she talks about las Adelitas. Women came into their own, and they started being very involved, and we didn't take a second step then to men either as students or later on when we became professors either. And I think that that was a really important thing that maybe we can talk about later on if we have the opportunity. I also think that we need to realize that we're part of not only other movements within the state, but also throughout the Southwest. You had Rodolfo Corte Gonzalez in Denver, Colorado, who did the first Chicano liberation movement in 1969. You had Reyes Tijerina, who was fighting for property rights in New Mexico. So it was really a time when we were coming into a lot of these kinds of knowledge. And the other thing that was really important about this time too is that we came sort of out of our own little group. And we became involved with blacks who were fighting for these issues, with Asians who were fighting for these issues. And I have a photograph that somehow resurfaced the other day at my home that shows that Las Adelitas and myself and Chris Bassard, who was a professor in Black Studies, planning the Third World Women's Conference. So it's a real consciousness that our issues were the issues of other groups as well. And there was a united front, I think, at that time for a lot of the kinds of things that we did. And when we confronted the administration from then on, it wasn't just Chicanos doing it, it was other of the minority groups as well that were involved with it. And so I think that I want to end my comments today because there's so many other incidents that we could talk about. But I do want to mention that during 1969, during this period, at the Liberation Conference in Denver, Colorado, Alurista, who was a poet, wrote El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán. That was when the concept of Aztlán was introduced, and when our political ideology, somebody wrote it. And I remember that even Historia Carolina was a professor when we first started teaching classes, and that's going to be for another timeline. We used to use Xerox copies of articles and poems and so forth. But he was really the precursor of the first Chicano art, Chicano literature coming out. Malaquias Montoya, the first Chicano art coming out. So now we have thousands of books, thousands literally, on Chicano studies and Chicano issues. But it was that small beginning. And I just want to end by reading his poem, because it was sort of the mantra of the Chicano movement at that time. And he wrote it in '69, the exact time that we're talking about. And he called it Stupid America. And it exemplified what we were fighting for and the issues of the Chicano movement at the time. And he said, "Stupid America, see that Chicano with a big knife in his steady hand? He doesn't want to knife you. He wants to sit on a bench and carve price figures, but you won't let him. Stupid America, see that Chicano shouting curses on the street? He is a poet without paper and pencil. And since he cannot write, he will explode. Stupid America, remember that Chicanito flunking math and English? He is the Picasso of your Western states, but he will die with 1,000 masterpieces hanging only from his mind." And that's the kind of thing we were trying to avoid. Thank you so much.